My husband pressed his hand over my mouth to muffle my screams while I was having a miscarriage, because his mother was asleep in the next room and he didn't want the noise to wake her. He stood at the bathroom door, looked at me on the floor, looked at his phone, and said, "Let's just wait and see if it passes." It did not pass. And when I finally called 911 myself, from the floor of that bathroom with blood soaking through my nightgown and the tiles cold and hard against my cheek, I understood with total and permanent clarity that the man I had married was not going to choose me. He had never been going to choose me. But that was the night I stopped waiting for him to, and everything that happened after that was mine. My name is Nora. I was 29 years old when all of this happened, and I had been married to Marcus Hale for 3 years and living in his mother's orbit for all of them, which is not the same as living in his mother's house. We had our own apartment, 20 minutes across town, but felt, in practice, indistinguishable from it. The orbit was the thing. The gravitational pull of a woman who had raised her son to believe that her comfort was the organizing principle of any room he entered, and who had, over 32 years of patient, loving, absolute work, made herself the center of a solar system in which everything else, including me, including our marriage, including the life we were supposedly building together, was simply a body in rotation around her. Let me tell you who Marcus was before I tell you what he did, because the what without the who is just a story about a bad night, and this was never just a bad night. Marcus Hale was 34 when we married, a high school history teacher with a gift for explaining complicated things in clear, accessible language that his students genuinely responded to, and which made him, in conversation, one of the most engaging people I had ever met. He could take any subject, the causes of the First World War, the domestic politics of the Roman Empire, the mechanics of how a single assassination in Sarajevo became a global catastrophe, and make you feel the weight of it, the human stakes in it, the way small decisions by individual people rippled outward into history in ways they never anticipated. I found this quality of his mind genuinely thrilling in the early years, and I want to be honest about that, because it matters for understanding how I ended up where I did. I was not naive. I was not without discernment. I was a woman who fell in love with a genuinely intelligent, genuinely engaging man and took, as people in love do, far too long to understand that intelligence and insight in the abstract do not automatically translate into the capacity to see clearly the things that are closest to you. Marcus could explain exactly why the Roman Empire fell while being entirely unable to see that his own household was structured around a dynamic that was slowly dismantling me. He was perceptive about everything that wasn't his mother, and completely blind about everything that was. Her name was Diane. Diane Hale, 61 years old, a retired school administrator who now devoted the organizational capabilities she had once deployed on a staff of 40 teachers to the project of her son's life. She was a small, precise woman, thin in the way of people who eat carefully and move deliberately, with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain and the particular quality of stillness that very controlled people have, the kind of stillness that is not peace but containment, everything held carefully in place. She lived in a brick colonial house 20 minutes from our apartment, a house that smelled of lavender sachets and lemon wood polish and the particular dry warm smell of a home that is kept at exactly the right temperature at all times by someone who considers temperature management a form of personal discipline. The house was immaculate in a way that felt slightly aggressive, every surface clear and purposeful, every object in it in the precise location Diane had assigned it, unmoved and unmovable. Visiting that house always gave me a feeling I could not immediately name, and it took me 2 years to understand that the feeling was the feeling of being in a space where my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, where I was a variable that had been accounted for but never quite incorporated into the design. Diane called Marcus every morning. Every single morning, without exception, at 7:15, before he left for work. The calls lasted between 12 and 20 minutes. I know this because I had, over 3 years of marriage, grown so accustomed to the sound of his voice in the kitchen while I was getting ready in the bedroom, the particular cadence of the way he spoke to her, lower and softer than he spoke to anyone else, with a kind of careful attentiveness that I had once found touching and now recognized as something more complicated, that I had developed an involuntary internal clock for them. On the mornings when she called at 7:17 instead of 7:15, I noticed. On the mornings when the call ran to 25 minutes, I noticed. I had never mentioned this noticing to Marcus, because mentioning it would have required a conversation that I had been not having for 3 years, and not having it was a decision I renewed every morning with the same tired deliberateness of someone who keeps putting off a dental appointment. She also came to dinner every Tuesday and every other Thursday. These were not irregular drop-ins but scheduled, calendared events that predated our marriage and that Marcus had never questioned or modified, and which I had, in the beginning, tried to enter into with genuine goodwill. I had cooked for those dinners, real cooking, things I put actual thought into, a chicken marsala one Tuesday, a pasta with homemade sauce another week, a roast that I'd spent 3 hours on a Thursday. Diane ate whatever I made with the careful attention of someone who is evaluating rather than enjoying, and she commented in ways that were always technically positive but somehow always arrived with a small qualifier attached. This is quite good, I usually do mine with a bit more time. The pasta is nice, I think Marcus prefers a thicker sauce. Very tender. I wasn't sure how it would turn out with that cut. Marcus ate everything I made with genuine enthusiasm and also never once told his mother to stop qualifying my food, because that would have required a specific kind of intervention that he had been trained his entire life not to make. There was a phone in our kitchen, a small, old-fashioned landline that Marcus had brought from his mother's house when we moved in together, one of those slim countertop models with a cord that had gotten slightly tangled over the years. I had never used it. We both had cell phones, a landline in an apartment in this decade was an anachronism, and I had mentioned once, mildly, that we didn't really need it. Marcus had gone quiet in a particular way and said that his mother sometimes called on it when she couldn't get through on his cell, that she found it more reliable, and I had let it go. That phone became, over 3 years, the thing I associated with Diane the way I associated Valentina's perfume with a tightening of the shoulders, reflexively, physically, without choosing to. Every time it rang, which happened with a frequency I could set a calendar by, something in my chest contracted slightly. It became, that phone, the object I looked at when I was calculating how much of my life was organized around someone else's needs without my consent. I want to tell you about the night before the miscarriage first, because that night contains something that I think about often, a small thing that I told myself meant nothing and which, in retrospect, meant everything. We had been trying to get pregnant for 8 months. Not a casual thing, not a we'll see what happens thing, a deliberate, scheduled, emotionally weighted effort that had produced, in those 8 months, 2 very early losses and a level of hope and disappointment cycling that was doing something to me that I was not fully acknowledging. I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I was also, at 11 weeks of this third pregnancy, more cautiously optimistic than I had allowed myself to be with the first 2, because we had made it further, and the 8-week ultrasound had showed a heartbeat, strong and clear, and I had let myself begin to believe. Marcus knew all of this. He was present for all of it, the appointments, the tests, the cautious optimism, the fear underneath it. He held my hand at the ultrasound. He was, in all the visible ways, a partner in this. On the Tuesday before the miscarriage, Diane came for dinner. I had made a simple lemon chicken, something easy, because I had been tired in the specific bone-weight way of early pregnancy and didn't have the energy for anything elaborate. Dinner was fine, ordinary in the way those Tuesday dinners were ordinarily fine, which is to say nothing remarkable happened, and Diane complimented the chicken with one qualifier. She usually added lemon zest as well as juice, for depth, and we talked about Marcus's students and Diane's garden and a documentary she had watched. And then she left at 8:30 and Marcus washed up and we went to bed early because I was exhausted. Before she left, Diane hugged Marcus at the door for a long moment, longer than usual, her small hands clasping his back with a firmness that made me notice it, and said, into his shoulder, "You're such a good boy. You've always been such a good boy." Marcus murmured something I couldn't hear. I watched from the hallway and thought, that is a strange thing to say to a 34-year-old man. And then I went to bed and forgot it, the way you forget the small strange things that don't seem important enough to hold on to, until later, when you understand that they were the whole architecture of the problem laid out in miniature. The miscarriage started at 2 in the morning. I woke from a dead sleep with a cramping that was different from any cramping I'd had before, sharper, lower, with a radiating quality that spread into my lower back and had me out of bed and in the bathroom before I was fully conscious. The bathroom light was harsh after the dark of the bedroom, and I blinked at it and understood, in the next 30 seconds, from what I saw and what I felt, that something was very wrong. I had been through this twice before, early, and this was not that, this was more, and the cold tile under my feet was real and the pain was real and I was scared in a way that was very clean and very simple. I needed help. I called out for Marcus. He appeared in the doorway still blinking, confused, hair pushed to one side from the pillow. I told him what was happening. I told him I needed him to call 911. And then he did the thing that I have thought about every day since, the thing that I have turned over and examined from every angle trying to understand it fully, the thing that is not complicated when you understand who Marcus Hale was and what he had been built to be. He looked at me, and then he looked at the wall that separated our bathroom from the bedroom of the apartment next door, and he said, "Mom is right on the other side of that wall." Because Diane was staying with us that week. Because her boiler had broken and she was having the system replaced and she needed somewhere to stay for 5 days, and of course it was with us, of course, where else, and her room was the second bedroom which shared a wall with our bathroom, and she had mentioned at dinner 2 nights before that she had been having trouble sleeping. And Marcus, standing in the doorway of the bathroom where his wife was on the floor with blood on her nightgown, looked at that shared wall and made a calculation. "She just got to sleep," he said. "Can't you just breathe through it for a bit? Let's see if it settles." He said it in a low voice, careful, as if volume itself were the concern. As if the appropriate response to his wife's medical emergency was to manage the acoustics. "The siren," he said. The siren would wake her. He'd been trying to get her to sleep for an hour, she was so wound up about the boiler, and he didn't want to, he was sure it would. His voice kept going in that low, careful register, arranging the situation the way he arranged everything around his mother's comfort, and I was on the floor of the bathroom, and the pain was a live thing now, and something in me understood with perfect precision that I was looking at the moment I had been accumulating evidence for over 3 years without quite naming it. I reached past him. My phone was on the bathroom counter where I'd left it for the charger, and I picked it up, and I called 911 myself. He stood in the doorway while I did it. He did not try to stop me. He just stood there, and his face was doing something complicated that I did not have the energy or the attention to decode, because I was talking to a dispatcher and trying to remember our address and trying to hold myself together on a cold tile floor, and the dispatcher was calm and competent and told me to stay on the line and help was coming, and it was coming with a siren, and the siren woke Diane, and I knew it woke her because I heard her bedroom door open and her voice in the hallway. "Marcus? Marcus, what's happening?" and his voice answering her, low and reassuring, before he came back to me. The paramedics were there in 7 minutes. I know because I counted. They were efficient and kind and they used my name and they got me onto a stretcher and out of that bathroom, and Marcus rode in the ambulance with me, holding my hand, and his face was genuine in its fear. I want to be clear about this, because I think clarity matters here more than narrative convenience. He was scared. He loved me, in the way that people can love someone and still, in the crisis moment, reveal the precise order of their priorities. He loved me and he had stood in the doorway of the bathroom and made a calculation about a siren. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and understanding that they were both true was the thing that took me the longest and cost me the most. I was at the hospital for 6 hours. The pregnancy was not viable and there was nothing that could have been done differently, the doctor told me with the careful kindness of someone who has delivered this information many times and has not lost the ability to mean it. I was not in danger now. I would need rest, follow-up care, time. Marcus sat beside my bed in the emergency bay and held my hand and said nothing for long stretches, and in those silences I heard, underneath everything, the low hum of a hospital that keeps going regardless of what any individual in it is experiencing, and the specific quality of a silence between two people when something has been understood that cannot be ununderstood. I did not say anything to him about the bathroom. Not that night. I was too hollowed out, too stripped of everything non-essential, to have that conversation from a hospital gurney. But it was there, between us, visible to me the way things are visible when you finally allow yourself to look directly at them. We came home at 7 in the morning. Diane had made coffee and toast, which were on the kitchen table, and she stood when we came in and looked at me with an expression of genuine sympathy, and I want to be accurate here too, because Diane was not a simple villain, she was a complicated woman who did love her son and who did, in her way, feel something for me in that moment, and she said, "Oh, my poor girl." She said it sincerely. She put her hand on my arm. And then she looked at Marcus and said, "I heard the siren." I was so worried. And the word worried, in her mouth, was about the siren. About having been woken by it. And Marcus looked at his mother and said, "I know, Mom. I'm sorry." He apologized to her. He apologized to his mother for the siren that had saved his wife. I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen and understood that I had moved, in the past 6 hours, from one world into another, and there was no going back to the one I had been in before. I did not leave immediately. I want to tell you this because I think it is important. I think the version of this story where I walked out of the hospital and straight into a new life is cleaner and more satisfying, but is not what actually happened, and I am telling you what actually happened. I stayed for another 6 weeks, because I was recovering, because I was grief-stricken in a way that made large decisions feel impossible, and because I was still, even then, capable of finding reasons to wait. But those 6 weeks were not passive. They were the weeks in which I became very quiet and very watchful and very deliberate in a way I had not been before, and the things I saw and heard and understood during them were the things that made everything that came after possible. But I need to tell you what I found first. And what I found is the thing that transformed quiet watchfulness into something with actual teeth. It was on a Thursday in the 3rd week after the hospital. Diane had gone home, her boiler was fixed, her routine restored, and I was in the apartment during the day while Marcus was at school, recovering, resting, doing the things the doctor had told me to do and also, quietly, beginning to map the landscape of my situation. I was looking for the apartment lease. We were coming up on our annual renewal and I had questions about the renewal terms that I wanted to review before Marcus and I discussed them. The lease was in the file box we kept in the closet, a gray plastic box with a lid, organized by category, the way Marcus organized everything. I found the lease quickly enough, and I would have put the box away and thought nothing more of it, except that when I lifted the lease out I disturbed the papers beneath it, and a folded document slid sideways and partially unfolded as it fell, and I saw, on its visible half, the words beneficiary designation form. The thing about a beneficiary designation form is that it is not, in itself, alarming. Life insurance policies have them. Retirement accounts have them. The alarming thing, the thing that made my fingers go very still on the lid of the box and made the air in the closet feel suddenly slightly thicker, was what I read when I picked the document up and opened it fully. It was a beneficiary designation for Marcus's life insurance policy, a term life policy his school district provided, $120,000. The primary beneficiary was listed as Diane Ellen Hale. The date of the designation was 14 months ago. We had been married for over 2 years at the time it was filed. I stood in the closet for what felt like a long time and was probably 45 seconds. My hands were not shaking. My breathing was deliberate and slow, each breath a small, conscious act of steadiness. I looked at the document. I looked at his mother's name in the primary beneficiary field. I looked at the date. I thought, this was filed 18 months into our marriage. I thought, I did not know about this. I thought, a married person's default beneficiary on a life insurance policy is their spouse. Changing it to someone else requires a deliberate act, a form, a signature, a choice. I thought, 14 months ago, Marcus made a deliberate choice that I was not his primary beneficiary, and he did not tell me. I sat down on the closet floor, because sitting seemed like the right response to the specific quality of what I was feeling, which was not quite grief and not quite rage but something older and more fundamental than either, the feeling of a structure you have been living inside revealing itself, all at once, to be built of something different than what you thought. The house looked the same from the inside. But the walls were not what I had believed they were made of. I held the document in my lap and looked at the shoes lined up on the rack above me, Marcus's work shoes, my weekend sneakers, the winter boots neither of us had worn yet this season, and I thought about the night in the bathroom, and then I thought about the apology to Diane for the siren, and then I thought about 14 months ago, Marcus sitting down somewhere and filling out a form that put his mother's name where my name should have been, and I understood, the way you understand something when three separate pieces of a puzzle suddenly align and show you an image that was there the whole time, that I was not the primary person in my own marriage. I had never been. I took a photo of the document with my phone. Both pages. I put it back where I found it, in the same position, with the same casual slant it had had before I disturbed it. I put the lease on top of it. I put the lid back on the box. I put the box back in the closet. I closed the closet door. And then I went to the kitchen and called my older sister, Raina, who lived 40 minutes away and who had, over the 3 years of my marriage, said very little about Marcus and Diane but whose silences on this subject had always been the particular, weighted kind that contain a great deal of opinions being carefully held in reserve. Raina picked up on the first ring. She had a gift for answering the phone as if she had been expecting the call, regardless of whether she had been. "Hey," she said, in her normal voice. I told her I needed to talk to her. She said okay. I told her I needed her to come over. She said she'd be there in 45 minutes. She did not ask why. She did not say, "Is everything okay?" in the anxious, probing way of someone who needs reassurance before they can mobilize. She said she'd be there in 45 minutes, and she was there in 42. We sat at my kitchen table with tea. She made it, because I was still moving in the slightly suspended way of someone whose body is following instructions from a mind that is operating at a different altitude, and I told her about the document. I told her about the night in the bathroom, which she had not known about in full, because I had given her a version of it at the time that omitted the part about the siren and the wall and Marcus's calculation. I had omitted that part because I was not ready, 6 weeks ago, to say it out loud to someone who would hold it as information. Now I was. I told her all of it, and Raina listened the way she had always listened, without interrupting, without her face moving dramatically through reactions, just steady and present and taking it in. When I finished, she wrapped both her hands around her mug and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you been holding all of this?" I told her the truth, most of it, most of 3 years, in one form or another. She nodded slowly, the nod of someone whose internal calculation has just been confirmed. "Okay," she said. "Here's what we're going to do." She said it with the particular calm authority of an older sister who has spent 33 years being the person in the room who figures out what to do next, and I felt something in my chest that had been clenched for a very long time release, slightly, at the sound of it. What we were going to do, according to Raina, was talk to a lawyer. Not because I had necessarily decided anything, but because understanding your position is not the same as committing to a course of action, and I needed to understand my position before I could make any decision. She had a name, a friend of hers who had gone through a divorce 2 years earlier and recommended her attorney, a woman named Carol Whitmore who practiced family law and whom Raina described as the kind of person who doesn't sugarcoat anything but also doesn't make you feel worse than the situation already requires. I called Carol Whitmore's office from the kitchen table, with Raina sitting across from me, and made an appointment for the following Monday. The appointment with Carol Whitmore was on a gray Monday morning, the kind of day that feels colorless in a way that is appropriate to the business of ending things. Her office was in a brick building downtown, 3 floors up, with a waiting room that was deliberately calming, soft chairs, neutral walls, a shelf of plants that someone clearly tended with real attention, a window that looked out on a courtyard where the last of the autumn leaves were down and the branches were bare and honest against the sky. The receptionist brought water without being asked and didn't make conversation, which I appreciated. I sat with my hands in my lap and looked at the courtyard and thought about what I was about to do, which was not deciding to end my marriage but was, I knew, the first step of a process that was going to end it, because I had understood in the past 6 weeks that there was no version of the conversation I needed to have with Marcus that ended with us in the same place we had been before, and the place we had been before was already not acceptable. Some doors open in only one direction. Carol Whitmore was 50-ish and direct in the way of someone who has heard a great many versions of a great many stories and has no patience for anything that isn't the essential fact of the situation. She had short dark hair and a quality of attention that made you feel, as you talked, that every word was going somewhere useful. She did not take notes ostentatiously, but I noticed a pad beside her on which she occasionally made small marks. I told her about the bathroom. I told her about the beneficiary form. I told her about the 3 years of Diane and Tuesday dinners and daily phone calls and the particular architecture of a marriage in which the husband's primary loyalty had never been to the person he married but to the person who raised him. Carol listened to all of this and then asked me several precise questions about the nature of our joint finances, whether there were assets in both our names, what I was earning versus what he was earning, whether there were any other documents I had found that I'd photographed. I gave her clean, specific answers, because I had been preparing them in my head for 4 days. When we were done, she leaned back slightly and looked at me with the kind of direct, unvarnished assessment that I had come to find, in certain people, more genuinely respectful than any amount of warmth. The beneficiary form is relevant, she said. Not as evidence of anything criminal, but as a documentation of a pattern. Courts care about patterns. Combined with what you've described about the financial structure of the marriage and the incident in March, the bathroom, what you have is a picture of a marriage in which your needs were consistently subordinated to a third party's preferences. That is relevant to equitable distribution discussions. It is also simply true. She paused. You know that already. You came in here knowing it. You just needed someone with standing to say it out loud. I told her she was right. She said she usually was, and the tiniest hint of something that might have been a smile crossed her face. We scheduled a follow-up for the following week and she told me what to bring. I drove home from Carol Whitmore's office and sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes before I could make myself go upstairs. The car was warm and the garage was dim and I looked at my hands on the steering wheel and I thought about who I had been 3 years ago, the woman who fell in love with a man because of the way he could make history feel urgent and human and alive, and I tried to locate in that woman the version of me who was sitting in this car right now, and found her, still there, still recognizable, just considerably clearer-eyed than she had been. The steering wheel was smooth under my palms. I pressed them flat against it for a moment, feeling the give and resistance of it. Then I took a breath and went upstairs. Marcus came home that evening with takeout from the Thai place we liked, and we ate dinner, and he talked about his day, and I listened and asked the right questions, and afterward I told him I had gone to a doctor's appointment for follow-up care, which was half true. The appointment with Carol was a kind of care, the most important kind, and he said he was glad I was taking care of myself and he put his hand over mine on the table, and I let him, and I looked at his face and thought, there is a person in there who loves me. I was certain of it. I had never stopped being certain of it. The love was simply insufficient, as a force, to override what he had been made to be. Loving someone is not the same as being able to put them first. I had been confusing those two things for 3 years, and I was done. I told him on a Saturday, 2 weeks after the appointment with Carol. I had chosen Saturday deliberately, no work, no obligations, enough daylight to get through the initial conversation without either of us having somewhere else to be. I waited until the morning, after his 7:15 call with Diane, which had proceeded on schedule, 22 minutes by my count, and then I sat across from him at the kitchen table and told him I wanted a separation, and then I told him why, with the specificity and clarity that I had been rehearsing not in front of a mirror but inside my own head, in the in-between moments of the preceding 2 weeks, building it the way he built his history lessons, from the most essential facts outward. I told him about the bathroom, again, but this time in full, without the mitigation I had applied at the time. I told him about the beneficiary form. I told him what I understood now about the architecture of our marriage that I had not understood, or had not allowed myself to understand, before. He sat across from me and he was very still. Not defensive, not immediately. There was a quality to his stillness that reminded me, painfully, of what I had loved most about him, the capacity for genuine listening, the willingness to let something land before he responded. He let it land. And then he said, with a voice that was lower than his usual register, and slower, I didn't want the siren to wake her. He said it not as a defense but as a confession, as if saying it plainly was the thing he needed to do, and the plainness of it was the most honest moment we had had in our marriage. I know that, I said. I know you didn't. And I know that you love me. I have never doubted that you love me. I paused. But when you had to choose between my emergency and her sleep, Marcus, you chose her sleep. You stood in that doorway and you calculated. He looked at the table. The kitchen light above us was the same kitchen light it had always been, warm and ordinary. The landline on the counter was in its same place, cord slightly tangled. I know, he said. He did not say anything else. What followed was not a clean or quick process. Nothing real is. The separation took several months to formalize, during which we had many more conversations, some of them better than that Saturday morning and some of them considerably worse. There was a night, 3 weeks in, when Marcus came home from a visit to his mother's house. She had called him, upset, because she had heard from Marcus's aunt that we were separating, and the hearing it secondhand had wounded her in a way she needed him to come and address in person, and he came home at 10 at night having been there for 4 hours, and when I asked how she was he said she was devastated, and something in the way he said it, the weight he put on that word, told me that he had been there for 4 hours being devastated for his mother, and that the 4 hours were not a choice he had made between her devastation and mine, but simply a response to the first devastation that presented itself. His mother's devastation was always, by orientation, the one he reached for. Mine had to announce itself, insistently, before it entered the picture. I want to tell you about the conversation with Diane, because there was one, and because I had been dreading it for weeks and it turned out to be the most clarifying conversation of all. She called me directly, not Marcus, me, which was unusual enough that when I saw her name on my cell phone I knew it was something different from the ordinary. I answered. She asked if she could come over, just to talk, and I said yes, because I had been talked into a great many things by implication over 3 years and was no longer in that particular habit, but also because I genuinely wanted this conversation. I wanted to look at her directly and say what I had been saying only in my own head for a very long time. She came over on a Tuesday, not a dinner Tuesday, not our old ritual, just a Tuesday, which already felt different. She was dressed well, her silver hair precise, her reading glasses on their chain, and she came in and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had sat with Marcus, with Raina, with myself on all those quiet mornings, and she folded her hands and looked at me with an expression that was, I thought, genuinely conflicted. Not performed. Genuinely conflicted, the expression of a woman who does love her son and has, perhaps, allowed that love to become a system that extracted from everyone around him in ways she has not fully accounted for. I know you think I've interfered, she said, with the particular care of someone who has rehearsed their opening. I know things have been difficult. I want you to know that I never meant. Diane, I said, and I said it the way I had learned to say her name over the past 2 months, without apology in it, without the slight deference that I had been putting there for 3 years as a kind of peace offering that was never acknowledged as such. I don't think you interfered as an act of malice. I think you love Marcus very much and you built a relationship with him over 32 years that is organized around you being the center of it, and I think that you never, not once, seriously considered what that would cost the people who tried to love him around the edges of it. I looked at her steadily. I think you made him into someone who could stand in the doorway of a bathroom where his wife was hemorrhaging and think about whether the siren would wake you. I don't think you meant to do that. I think it's the result of loving someone in a way that doesn't leave room. She opened her mouth. She closed it. The silence between us was the longest silence I had ever sat in with Diane Hale, and it was the first one that felt like truth. He called me from the ambulance, she said, finally, quietly. While you were in the hospital. He called me from the ambulance to tell me you were all right. She said it not as a defense but as something she was offering to me, information she thought I deserved to have. It landed strangely, he had called her from the ambulance, and I had not known this, and I sat with the image of it, Marcus in the ambulance beside me, holding my hand, also holding his phone and calling his mother to reassure her, and thought about what it meant to be the most important person in a room and simultaneously not the most important person to the person beside you. Both things, again, true at once. I know he loves me, I said. I know he called you because he needed to reassure you before he could be fully present with me. I know all of that. I paused. That's why I'm leaving. Diane was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than comfortable. Then she said, in a voice that was lower than I had ever heard from her, stripped of the composure she maintained so consistently, I didn't know it had gotten this bad. I believed her. That was the most painful part, I believed her, and the believing made it worse, not better, because ignorance at that scale is its own kind of damage, and she had been the cause of it while remaining genuinely unaware of being so, and that combination of causation and unawareness was the thing that made the whole system run. She left 40 minutes later. At the door, she paused with her hand on the frame and looked at me in a way I had not seen from her before, not evaluating, not managing, just looking. I hope you'll be all right, she said. I told her I intended to be. She nodded once, slowly, and left, and I closed the door, and I stood in the hallway of my apartment and listened to her footsteps on the stairs until they were gone. The legal process took 4 months, which is faster than it could have been because Marcus did not fight anything I asked for and because Carol Whitmore is as good as Raina said she was. I received my equitable share of the joint assets, which was somewhat more than half on account of the documentation of the financial pattern, the way our household spending had consistently prioritized Diane's needs over our own savings goals, the way Marcus had, over 3 years, spent approximately $9,000 in household funds on things for his mother's house and garden and maintenance without discussion or accounting. Carol laid this out in a document that was 12 pages long and which Marcus's attorney received and which produced, apparently, a very quiet conversation between attorney and client after which Marcus agreed to the equitable distribution without further negotiation. The beneficiary form was amended before the divorce was final. My name replaced Diane's. It was the most specific, concrete, documentable reversal of the whole pattern, and I found it, when Carol told me it was done, to be something close to poetic. What I want to tell you about the night before I signed the final papers is this: I did not sleep much, but the sleeplessness was not anxious. It was the sleeplessness of a person who is about to do something that cannot be undone and who wants to be awake for it, who doesn't want to sleepwalk into a new life but to arrive in it conscious. I sat in the kitchen at 3 in the morning with the lights off except for the small lamp above the stove, and the apartment was quiet in the way it was quiet now, genuinely quiet, not held-breath quiet, not the kind of quiet that is full of things not being said. The landline was still on the counter. I had moved it once, in the first weeks of the separation, just shifted it to a different spot, and Marcus had moved it back without mentioning it, and I had decided to let it stay until I was no longer in the apartment, which was almost now. I looked at it in the small cone of stovelight and thought about what it had meant, that phone, over 3 years, the 7:15 calls, the Tuesday dinners, the apology for the siren. All of it in the cord and the receiver and the slightly tangled cord of a phone I had never used. I thought, tomorrow I will not live here anymore, and the phone will stay, and the person it rings for will take care of it, and I will be somewhere else, and the somewhere else will be mine. I signed the papers on a Thursday morning. Carol's office, clean and direct, the potted plants still tended, the window still looking out on the courtyard where the trees were now bare and skeletal and entirely honest about what they were. I signed my name in 4 places with a pen Carol handed me, a solid pen, heavier than most, and I appreciated the weight of it, the sense of something substantial in my hand at the moment of something substantial being done. When it was finished, Carol set the pen down and said, "You know what you're doing." It was not a question. I told her I thought I was getting there. The new apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building 20 minutes from where we had lived, farther into the city, closer to the hospital where Raina worked. She was an ER nurse, which context added a layer to everything she had ever said about the night in my bathroom, all the things she had not said that she clearly knew and was holding in careful reserve. The apartment was smaller than the one I'd shared with Marcus, but the light in the main room was extraordinary in the mornings, coming through east-facing windows in long, horizontal bands that traveled across the floor as the morning progressed, and I had arranged my furniture to move with it. The bedroom was mine entirely. I had selected every piece of it, every pillow, every lamp. There was no landline. I heard from Marcus 3 times in the months following the divorce, each contact brief and not unkind. Once to let me know some mail had arrived for me. Once to ask about a document for the tax return. Once, on a Sunday evening, to call and say, in the particular way of someone who has been sitting with something for a while before deciding to say it, that he was sorry. "Not sorry that this happened," he said carefully. "I know what that sounds like, and that's not, I mean sorry for the bathroom. Specifically. That I made you call 911 yourself." He said it in a way that told me he had been working on saying it for some time, that it was not casual, that he knew it was too late for the apology to change anything and was offering it anyway as a piece of honesty he owed me. I told him I heard him. I told him I appreciated it. I told him I hoped he was doing all right, and I meant it, and we said goodbye. Raina came over the following Saturday with wine and takeout containers from the good Vietnamese place near her apartment, and we ate on the floor of my living room because I didn't have a proper dining table yet. I was still assembling things, still in the early, slightly sparse stage of a life being remade from the beginning, and she told me about her week, which was always eventful, the ER being what it is, and I told her about a new project at work that I was genuinely excited about, a branding project for a nonprofit that had real creative latitude in it, and we talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, and at some point she said, "You look different than you did 6 months ago." I asked her how. She thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought, which was very Raina. "Less managed," she said finally. "Like you're not doing the math anymore." I understood what she meant. I had spent 3 years doing an ongoing, invisible calculation, how to be in a marriage that required constant adjustment, constant reading of the room, constant calibration of what Diane needed and what Marcus needed and where I fit in the space that remained. I had been doing that math so continuously that I had stopped noticing I was doing it. Stopping felt not like freedom arrived but like weight set down, the particular relief of a burden you've been carrying long enough to forget its weight, until you put it on the ground. I still had the photographs of the beneficiary form on my phone. I thought about deleting them many times and didn't, for reasons I wasn't immediately able to articulate, and then one morning about 5 months after the divorce was final I understood what those reasons were. I was keeping them the way you keep evidence of something you once refused to see, not as punishment or grievance but as documentation of your own capacity for willful blindness, so that you cannot, later, pretend it wasn't visible. It was visible. It had always been visible. The landline on the counter, the 7:15 calls, the Sunday dinners with their careful qualifiers, the hand on his back and "you've always been such a good boy," all of it was the architecture of the problem, laid out plainly, and I had called it by other names for 3 years because calling it by its real name would have required me to make decisions I wasn't ready to make. I was ready now. I had been ready, really, since the bathroom floor, and the work of the month since then had been the work of catching the rest of myself up to what I had understood in that moment on the cold tile, with the dispatcher calm in my ear and the siren already on its way. I bought a small piece of art for the wall above my desk, a print of a painting I had found in a gallery I'd wandered into on a Saturday with no particular destination, a simple image of a telephone with its cord cut cleanly through, the severed end precise and deliberate, hanging in space. I bought it because I found it funny, which I did not expect to find anything funny for a while yet, and also because the cleanness of it was right. The cord had been cut. Not violently, not messily. Precisely, by someone who understood what they were doing and why. I hung it above my desk on a Sunday morning, using a level to get it straight, and stepped back to look at it, and thought, yes. That's the one. On the first morning of the new year, I made coffee in my kitchen, in the good morning light coming through the east window, and I sat at my desk with the mug in both hands and the print visible on the wall, and outside the window the city was doing what cities do on January 1st, starting again, in its overlapping, imperfect, continuous way, and I thought about the 7:15 calls I would never hear again, the landline I would never be in the same room with again, the particular sound of a phone I never used ringing in a kitchen I no longer lived in. I thought about the bathroom floor and the siren and what it had cost me and what it had given me, which was not a fair trade and was also, eventually, the only one available, and I was done trying to compute the fairness of it. The coffee was hot and the room was mine and the morning was quiet in the only way that mattered, the way where the silence belonged to no one but me.